Hello and welcome to this video from the Productive Pessimist Ltd. Myself, Ash, who is the Leadership and Business Development Head of the Productive Pessimist Ltd. And today we're going to be looking at how, as a leader or a member of a leadership team, you can help create a trauma-informed workplace. So we start with that by answering the question, what is trauma? And I suspect a lot of you will be rolling your eyes and going, oh, right, so, everybody's traumatized because I raised my voice in a meeting or I asked someone to stay half an hour late. That's not actually trauma, although a trauma-informed workplace would recognise why someone might respond in an unexpected way to what are perceived by others as entirely neutral and commonplace stimuli. So, for example, someone raising their voice or a request to stay late. So, what is trauma? Trauma is something that happens to somebody, almost exclusively a negative thing, that person's holistic brain-body system is, for one reason or another, unable to completely process. So that then leads to the question, of course, of what is a complete processing? A complete processing starts in the body, and it's the immediate, uncontrollable reaction to trauma. It's how the thing makes you feel before you think about what you're feeling. That then leads on to the biological and physiological fight, flight, freeze or fawn response, which we all know, we're all very familiar with. So obviously, the fight response is going to be, I'm going to attack the thing. Flight response, I'm going to run away from the thing. Freeze response, I don't know what I can do about the thing, so I'm not going to do anything. And I'm going to see what the thing does in response to me not doing anything. The fawn response, which is a more recent response that people have become aware of, is that you go, well, I'm going to try and make the thing like me. I'm going to try and make the thing believe that I'm actually on its side, and there's a belief that is actually a dynamic adaptive response to the threats that high abstract thinking life forms, of which humans are the most obvious example, are experiencing. We don't, for example, encounter many saber-toothed tigers anymore, but we do encounter a lot of people whose management style is very much at odds with the way we need to be managed. And we can't just refuse to work with those people. We have to find a way to cope and to still be able to earn a living with any kind of management or leadership. And so, it's one example of where the fawn response would come in. Another more harmful example, more genuinely toxic example, of course, would be domestic violence, where a partner goes into appeasement to try and make the violent person, the abusive person, moderate their behaviour and become less of a threat. So again, fight, flight, freeze or fawn are the physiological responses to the immediate unconscious emotional reaction to a trauma trigger, or a trauma stimulus rather. That then goes on into the brain, because the unconscious response and the physiological fight, flight, freeze, fawn is entirely in the bodily system. That then transfers to the second part of the holistic system, which is the brain. And the brain has a quite involved conversation with itself, where the hindbrain, or the reptilian brain, which is the brain we started life out with when we were very early humans, in whatever form you believe that took, and that deals with threats like saber-toothed tigers, drought, famine, and radical climate change, goes, this is what I think happened. And because it's rooted in very primal threats, it often gets it very, very wrong about what actually happened in a contemporary situation. For example, a board meeting or a non-abusive disagreement with a friend, colleague, or a domestic partner. And then the frontal cortex, which is a more recently developed part of highly organised life forms that are capable of abstract thought, comes in, and the frontal cortex goes, you know what, I don't think it actually is that thing. This is the objective elements of what happened, and I feel that they can better be explained by this thing. And the frontal cortex draws on a bank of social interaction evidence that it has, which is why part of the challenge for any developed society is actually ensuring that all members of its population have access to sufficient sociological education, and in this sense dynamic sociological education through repeated exposure to a range of social situations, so that the frontal cortex can create that memory bank of actually this is the more likely interpretation. And that's the complete processing, that dialogue happens. The frontal cortex goes, this is the more likely explanation. The ancient brain, the hind brain, the reptilian brain, which is constantly searching for stability and stasis, it really, really is resistant to change. It doesn't like it because historically change would mean threat. Goes, you've given me something that doesn't make sense to me because I'm not used to these things that you're talking about. I don't know anything about them, but you seem to. And so I'm going to, in the interests of staying stable and not having to deal with change, I'm going to accept that you're probably right. And I'm going to let you handle it. And the frontal cortex then takes over and accesses the memory bank of sociological dynamics and goes, okay, what have we learned about effective ways to respond to, for example, someone being in a bad mood and taking their bad mood out on us, or a situation where somebody is concerned about a possible future consequence of actions that are being taken or discussed in the moment. Wide range of things. And it goes, how have we learned to respond to these? And it pulls out those responses, it sorts through them, and it applies the most appropriate response. And this process is usually at most on a subconscious level, often on an unconscious level. So you might be vaguely aware of it, but more commonly you're not aware of it at all. And it takes a matter of seconds. Unfortunately, the processing of response to a traumatizing stimulus can be interrupted, and in modern life is frequently interrupted. Either by there are too many things going on that we have to be responding to at the same time, and so we physically stop ourselves processing a trauma response to go and deal with something else. So that's one thing. There's just too much going on, and we genuinely do not have the time or attention available to allow the trauma process to go through, because while the frontal cortex exchange will take seconds to at most minutes, the whole process can vary from, it can be completed in minutes, sometimes it takes several hours to complete, and we're often in a situation where we have many things to do over a period of several hours. Another interruption is somebody else in the situation goes, you're not allowed to react that way. You're not allowed to have the response that you are unconsciously having. You need to stop crying. You need to stop being angry. You need to just stop sitting there like a lemon. And so we have to drag ourselves out of the trauma processing protocol. And we have to force ourselves to not actually run that process. So we don't even start the process because often the initial response is deemed unacceptable. So and so sometimes there's an entirely neutral thing where we tell ourselves that immediately, oh, you're overreacting. This is a ridiculous reaction to what happened. And that seems reasonable. It seems like it's a highly organised thought thing to do, to go, oh, I'm putting this back in perspective. Actually, in the immediacy, it's the worst thing you can do. Because in order to get to a point where you can respond in proportion and appropriately to the actual stimulus, which we'll discuss in a moment, you have to complete the processing protocol for each instance of trauma you experience. And having made that point, you can imagine if someone experiences a lot of trauma, particularly in a relatively short period, they may need a considerable amount of time that they're often not being given and they're not able to access to complete that protocol over and over and over again for the different forms of trauma. You can also imagine how difficult it becomes for that processing protocol to complete when someone is in active trauma. That's actually leads to a condition that is recognised as CPTSD, which is complex post-traumatic stress disorder, where the trauma isn't in the past. The trauma is in the active present. And the person is able to recognise it as trauma, but they're not able to run the trauma processing protocols for it. So that then leads to, what does this have to do with me as a leader, me as someone who is dealing with a whole bunch of people in a workforce? How do I get these people to just get with the program? Well, the first thing you have to understand is that almost everybody who comes to you to do work for you or with you or on behalf of you is going to be a person who has encountered trauma. We don't generally make it to adulthood as humans without encountering some level of trauma, because a trauma stimulus is a very personal and individual thing. For example, a trauma stimulus for me happens to be police sirens. Most people would just not respond to police sirens because they're just background noise. I hasten to add that's not because I led a life of crime prior to becoming a business consultant. It's because a more widely not great situation happened in which police cars were involved, along with other emergency services attending. I was a victim in that situation. I wasn't the perpetrator. But the trigger, the triggering stimulus from that for me, out of the whole range of things that happened in that situation, has become police sirens and uniforms more widely. Obviously, those are things I have to work on processing so that I can have a neutral reaction, because uniforms and sirens are going to be part of everyday life, and I can't just go, well, I'm never going to leave the house and I'm going to live with earphones in all the time in case I encounter any of this stuff, even as something I can hear through the window. So that's one thing. Somebody else may have a trauma stimulus of people raising their voices. because that is the thing that they weren't able to process from a wider traumatizing event. And that's the important thing, is the distinction between the traumatizing stimulus and the traumatizing event. The traumatizing event is what happened. The traumatizing stimulus is the element of it that you weren't able to fully process. And that may mean that you weren't able to respond to it at all. You just didn't know how to respond. It may be that actually you got as far as the frontal cortex taking over, and then the frontal cortex shrugged and went, I don't have anything. I don't know what the reasonable explanation for this is or how we should respond to it. And so you never got an answer. And, people are going to have different kinds of trauma. Some people will actually be fairly certain that they've never had any traumatizing event. Because the traumatizing stimulus from the event, and indeed the event itself, is so commonplace, is so seemingly inconsequential, that they think, well, this can't be trauma. For example, the traumatizing event that your brain and body processed as trauma, but your frontal cortex didn't get involved with, may have been actually being told that you couldn't have a particular item of clothing that you wanted as a child. And that's fairly normal. Parents will say no for a wide variety of reasons, most of them usually fairly logical and sound, some of them not so much. The traumatizing stimulus from that, because you don't get to choose what is perceived by the brain-body system as trauma, that's a decision that's taken way before you're even consciously thinking about what's happening. And the traumatizing stimulus may be green shirts. It sounds ridiculous. I can hear the laughter even while I'm talking essentially to myself here. But, it may be that this person, and they don't even know because they didn't perceive it at the time as a traumatizing event, but their brain and body did. And they weren't able to complete the protocol for processing trauma. And so their traumatizing stimulus is green shirts, and they just find themselves having really weird reactions to green shirts. So the traumatizing event is what happened, the whole situation. The traumatizing stimulus is the aspect of it that your holistic brain-body system wasn't able to process. And as I said, by the time we get to adulthood, most of us, if not all of us, have had at least one traumatizing event, and often many of them. So you're not going to have a trauma-free workplace. And actually your working practices themselves are going to create traumatizing events. It's a traumatizing event to tell your staff that your company reserves are critically low and that means you may have to make redundancies. It's a traumatizing event when systems you rely on crash. It's a traumatizing event when you're dealing with staff shortages due to long-term and unplanned absence. And these are everyday things in businesses. These aren't things that you can avoid. It's not. I'm not here to say you need to make all the trauma events go away. You can't do that. And in life in general, you can't make the trauma events go away. They're going to happen. What you can do as a leader in your workplace, as a leadership team, as a line manager, as someone with responsibility, is to create a workplace culture that allows people to complete the processing protocol for traumatizing stimuli. And what does that look like in practice? It looks like not telling someone that their reaction is inappropriate. Not saying, stop crying, stop shouting at me, stop sitting there like that. It may be inappropriate for them to go through that in the space they're in, And so you absolutely can say, can I just ask you to step outside while while you're having your feelings about this? And when you've reached a point where you feel calmer, we can talk about it. And that point doesn't have a time limit on it. Okay? You can't say, take 5 minutes and then come and find me in my office. Because the processing may not be complete in 5 minutes. It may not be complete in 5 hours. It might be complete in 5 days at the end of that week. And you have to allow that. You have to allow the initial reaction. You can step in to mitigate harm and disruption, but you cannot stop the initial reaction unless, and this is a really important thing, unless the initial reaction itself could provoke a genuine traumatizing event or cause actual harm. And that's important. And that centres around, does the person have a weapon, or are they becoming extremely violent and they are likely to harm themselves or others in a way that creates a predictably traumatizing event. In those circumstances, they need to be removed entirely so that they can be separate from the wider workforce while they have their reaction. Then, so you need to let them have their reaction. You can't tell them, don't cry, don't shout at me, stop looking at me like that. And even perfectly normal things with making jokes about, oh gosh, it's so awful when you're doing discipline with somebody who they just cry at everything. Because what that tells people is, oh okay, an unacceptable reaction here is crying. So if I start crying, I have to stop because this person doesn't like it. You let people have their reactions. Even if you don't like them, you let them have them. Even if they make you uncomfortable, you let them have their immediate reactions. Then you give them genuine space to process. And that might be that you go, hey, go and take some admin work into the break room and just work on that while you're dealing with how you feel about this. It might be, I think you need to go home. Try and phrase that though as, would you like to go home? It might be asking, do you want to go and get a coffee? And actually physically taking them off site to a neutral venue and going, hey, I'm going to buy you a coffee because it seems like you're having a rough day. Don't talk to them until they've drunk their coffee, if that's the choice you make, is to take them off site for something. And you can usually see when someone has gone through the physiological fight, flight, freeze, fawn response, and they've processed that, because they will often start showing physical signs. Often they will start yawning, or their body position will change, or they'll start chattering. And you know what I mean by chattering is when the person is just talking a lot, often very fast, about not very much. Those are all signs of what we call discharge. And it's the body having had a very intense and very draining response protocol inflicted on it. And it's coming back to itself, and the brain is going, we need to re-enter a state of equilibrium. So the discharge happens. And once the discharge behaviours are complete, then the exchange between the ancient brain and the frontal cortex can start taking place. And that's a very, very rapid process. And that's the point. When that's complete, often you'll get the person will reinstate eye contact, or they will sigh or stretch or alter their physical position, and they'll go, okay, so about all of that. And that's the point you can go, tell me about all that. You don't come in with how you felt about it as a leader or a manager. You come in and go, so tell me about all of that. because the person is in a place where their frontal cortex has provided them with an explanation. And it's usually also provided them with, how do we avoid this going forward? And you listen to what that person says needs to happen so that they don't respond to things in that way again. Because the important thing is, the trigger stimulus that is an innocuous thing that causes a quote-unquote overreaction is actually an innocent and innocuous event that causes a psychological memory of a trauma event. So, for example, for me, women shouting and sirens are my two trigger stimulus for the wider trauma event that I experienced in my past. And what I need with those, my frontal cortex, this is how we stop an quote-unquote overreaction to women raising their voices or sirens, is I need people to communicate with me in writing when they are angry or upset or having strong emotions in reaction to me. Because you can shout in writing, you can use block capitals, but it's less impactful. And it means I can read it through and I'm responding to what you actually said, rather than what my emotions told me you meant. In the case of sirens, it's an entirely internal process that I have to go to, and it's just, the request is, I am going to have a reaction, I'm going to try and keep it as minimal as possible, but I might need to leave the room. And please respect that I need to do that. I will come back and I'll get straight on with my work. And so, when a person says, I need you when you need to have a difficult conversation with me, I need you to put that in writing. When you are trying to initiate a conversation with me, I need you to tell me what the conversation is going to be about. Someone might say, I need you to not put me in crowded situations. I need you to not spring things on me at the last minute, even if it's a meeting. I need advance notice of that. And, sometimes it's not possible to give advance notice. I completely get that. Where it's not, you apologise. Because actually, when someone has said, this is what helps me to have a safe and proportionate response to something that is a traumatising trigger for me, because my brain interprets it as being the same as a traumatising event that I went through that's nothing to do with you. I'm not blaming you for that. It happened before I was even involved with you. When someone said, this is what I need to do to have a better reaction, where you are unable to meet that because of circumstances, you are actually crossing a boundary that person has drawn. And sometimes we have to cross boundaries because we end up in situations that we are not in control of, where those boundaries have to be crossed. But the recognition that you are doing something actually very extreme and crossing a boundary needs to happen. So, for example, you go, I'm really sorry. I know we discussed that you need at least 24 hours notice of meetings, but this situation has just blew up out of nowhere today, and it would be really, really helpful if you were able to be in the meeting today. I'm happy to give you some time to de-stress after the meeting. Are you able to come to the meeting even though it's short notice? So it's that respecting of when someone has said, this is how I can have a better response. It's putting in place a culture where someone is allowed to speak freely and to say no without consequence. There may be consequences to the things they say when they are speaking freely. For example, if someone speaking freely goes, well, I think everybody here is a complete joke and, actually, you specifically are corrupt, that's going to cause consequences. There shouldn't be a consequence to someone saying no. Okay? And I know that's a hard thing for leadership teams and managers to hear. Because often, as a leader, you don't feel you can say no to situations. And that's an important boundary and an important thing for you to have in place as well, that you can say no without consequence. And absolutely, you can explain to someone how their no is going to impact the company or their team, but they are still allowed to say, I understand that, but actually, the impacts aren't my problem. I am my problem. And I am doing what I have been asked to do. I am doing what I am able to do beyond that. And at this point, this is not something I am able to do beyond what is required and expected of me. They are allowed to say no. And finally, you have a rule in your organisation that people do not gossip about other people. At least while they're on site. You can't really control what people are doing off site, because it actually makes it a lot easier to deal with the inevitable things of someone gets their feelings hurt, goes to HR, and it all becomes a big thing. HR then have a simple protocol of they go to the person who's being complained about and go, simply, you know that we don't allow people to gossip about their colleagues here. You are allowed to not like people. You are allowed to come to a manager, a leader, a member of HR if a person is doing something that is actively harmful and detrimental to the company or to people within the company. You are not allowed to gossip about them. You are not allowed to have conversations about people without including them, unless there is a high risk element to their behaviour, or their behaviour is actively criminal and the discussion needs to happen without them in the initial stages. 3 things that actually don't cost you any money at all, that don't require you to go through convoluted hoops. Allowing people to say no, allowing people to speak freely, allowing people to have the response they have and to go through that response fully, and actually saying, except in very extreme circumstances and very specific circumstances which we have detailed, you do not have conversations about your colleagues that don't include them. Because a lot of the traumatizing events that people experience happen because of other people. They're not unavoidable situations. Some of them are. Obviously, things like the Manchester Arena bombing. Yes, it happened because of other people and decisions that other people took. But because we can't really know why those people took those decisions, it was an unavoidable event. A moral, true unavoidable event is a thing like a storm that destroys someone's house. Again, we couldn't have stopped it. There's nothing that could have been done, and we just have to deal with how people feel and how they end up continuing to feel in the wake of something like that. But an awful lot of traumatizing events are down to people, in whole or in part. And as leaders, your job is to become and to create better people. Thank you for listening to this video today, and if you would like to book an appointment to help you design and develop and implement the culture that supports a trauma-informed workplace. Feel free to drop us an email at theproductivepessimist@yahoo.com or give us a call on 0748 2017 927, and our phones are available Tuesdays to Fridays, so Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday and Fridays, between the hours of 8:30am to 6:30pm, Sundays 9:30am to 1:30pm, and we aim to respond to emails the next working day on all occasions. So again, that's theproductivepessimist@yahoo.com, or call us on 0748 2017 927. Again, thank you for listening. Bye.